This is the Fantastic Fungi with Christian Schwarz. This morning, we are going to go on a fun virtual foray into the fantastic world of fungi. And I want to introduce our presenter. Christian Schwarz is a mushroom enthusiast and taxonomist and citizen science advocate from Santa Cruz, the land of milk, caps, and honey mushrooms. He studied at UC Santa Cruz and now spends his time photography and teaching about and making scientific collections of macrofungi. He is the co-author of Mushrooms of the Redwood Forest, a great book if you're interested in learning more about fungi, and he's slowly building a mycoflora for the Santa Cruz County. Before we get started, I'd like to say a short land acknowledgement statement. San Mateo County Parks acknowledges that our lands are located on the ancestral homeland of the Ohlone people, and that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. Indigenous communities have lived in and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and Indigenous peoples from many nations live and work in this region today. Please join us in acknowledging and honoring their ancestors, their elders, and their communities. Before we get to the main presentation, I'll quickly go over some information about the format of this webinar. As an attendee, we cannot see your video or hear you, but if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A feature and we'll go over the questions towards the end of the presentation. We'll also be recording this session and posting it to YouTube afterwards for those who cannot come today. All right, now I'll pass it over to Christian.
I think you have to let me start my video. I'm not sure how. It's telling me I can't. There we go. Hi, everybody. Can you see me? Not that you really need to see me. Most of what I'm going to be talking about will be in my presentation slides. But just as a way of introducing myself, my name is Christian Schwarz. I work at UC Santa Cruz, which is down a little south of San Mateo County. And I teach about fungi to all sorts of people, whether they're older folks or younger folks. I've taught as young as kindergarten before, but I'm really excited to be talking to people who are younger than my average students today. So thanks for joining me. I'm looking forward to talking to you all. I'm really going to be trying to introduce you to the world of fungi today. Who are these organisms? And getting you up to speed about how to recognize them, not to identify them, but to think about what kinds of organisms they are, what they do out in the environment, what the important ecological roles they play are. And some of the words I use might be big and confusing. I'm trying not to do that today. But if I say something that is confusing to you or that you want more information about or you want to know more about, you can put your questions in this Q&A, this chat that I think Catherine is going to be looking at. And hopefully I will answer all of your questions either in real time or maybe closer to the end of the talk. But I'm just going to get right into it now. Okay, just to check and make sure, can everyone see the screen? There should be 2 purple mushrooms on the screen and the words "A First Dive into the World of Fungi."
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Let's just get going then. So mushrooms are something that you might be familiar with in a lot of different ways. So you might know button mushrooms from the store, or your portobello mushrooms that you get at Trader Joe's or your natural food store. Or you might be lucky enough that your family knows how to go and identify wild mushrooms to eat, and you have a lot of fun going and collecting wild mushrooms. Or your family might have warned you that mushrooms are dangerous and they are to be avoided. That's what my family told me. My parents told me never to touch wild mushrooms. But today I want to encourage you not to be afraid of wild mushrooms. Just touching them, just paying attention to them, You're not going to be poisoned. This is sort of the main thing that people worry about when their families tell them that wild mushrooms are dangerous, is that, yes, some of them are poisonous, but there's a lot of things that are poisonous, like plants. Some plants are poisonous. Our cars are dangerous. Just because some of the wild mushrooms that live around us are toxic doesn't mean that you should be scared of all of them. And none of them will hurt you if you don't eat them. So as long as you're careful not to eat any wild mushrooms that you don't know how to recognize, you're not going to be hurt by them. They're just organisms that live in the forest around us. They're our neighbors, and touching them and picking them up and holding them is totally safe, and it'll help you learn to recognize them if that's something you decide you want to get better at. So when you go out in the woods, you go hiking, and you're curious about mushrooms, you don't need to be afraid about picking them up and touching them and handling them and looking at them closely. They're not so toxic that they're going to hurt you just like that. So that's something I want to start with. It's a really fun world to get into and pay attention to, and you should feel safe doing it as long as you don't eat anything that you don't know. So I saw someone's hand go up there. I don't know if maybe Catherine already answered it.
Looks like it went back down.
Okay. Catherine, I'm just going to let you decide whether or not you want to highlight a question as it comes in or wait till the end, and I'll just listen for you to unmute and tell me.
Sounds good.
Okay. So let's get into this a little further. Another way that you might be familiar with fungi, even though you don't realize it, is that when you leave your pancakes in the fridge too long, they start to look like this, right? You open that Tupperware after like a month and you go, oh my God, my pancake is not a pancake anymore. It's like some sort of modern art. Because everything that's happening on the surface of this pancake is fungus. It's mold. It's probably, in this case, a group of fungus called Penicillium. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's the fungus that we got the chemical penicillin from, which is an important medical tool that we use to treat certain kinds of diseases. So even though they ruined your pancakes, they've made some really important drugs that we use to keep ourselves healthy. So fungi are really important allies. Sometimes they can be a little annoying when they eat our leftovers in the fridge, but they're really, really important even in those cases. So these are fungi too. And even after you've looked at molds in your fridge, and even after you've seen wild mushrooms while you're out hiking, I want you to remember that the whole group of fungi, the whole kingdom of fungi, which is a big group of organisms on Earth, there are so many more than we can possibly pay attention to. A lot of them are little tiny microscopic things that you'd never see unless you're really specifically looking for them. Some of them live in really strange places that you wouldn't think to go look. So no matter how much you pay attention to fungi, even someone like me, where I spend my whole life paying attention to them, that's like what I do with all my time, there's so many fungi that I don't see. There's so many more of these critters than possibly meet the eye. It's an extremely diverse kingdom. If you start studying them, you're gonna be amazed at just how many millions of species there are, literally millions. We don't even know what a good estimate for how many species of fungi there are on Earth. And there's so many to be discovered. If you are, in middle school or high school right now, and you decide you want to get interested in these organisms and you start studying them now, you could be one of the first people to study a whole group of some of these organisms. If you specialize on one of these strange groups of fungi that people haven't really studied very much yet, you're going to be the first person to discover so much cool biology out there in the world. So I find it to be a really exciting group of organisms to deal with, because you can be like a pioneer. You can forge out into these unknown realms of organisms and be the first person to tell us about them. That's pretty cool. You can't do that with every group of organisms. Most birds are already well known, but most fungi, not the case. You could break new ground in our understanding of our neighbors on planet Earth if you study these things. Okay, but what are fungi? We've talked about mold. We've talked about mushrooms you might see on your hiking trails. But what do we mean when we use this word? how is it possible that the mold on your pancakes and the mushroom that you find while you're out hiking are the same? I mean, obviously they're not the same thing, but how are they in the same group? Why do we call all of these things under the same word, fungi? Well, the answer is they are like plants and animals in some ways, but they're not either plants or animals. They're not plants and they're not animals, which is strange. A lot of people think, okay, fungi, maybe there's some kind of plant. A mushroom sort of acts like a plant. It grows in the ground, doesn't move, but it's not a plant. And the reason it's not a plant is that they don't make sugar. So many of you probably know the word or have heard the word photosynthesis. This is a long, fancy science word, but all it means is that plants can make sugar out of sunlight and water and carbon dioxide, which is that gas that's in the air that we breathe. And this is a really amazing magic trick. Most organisms can't do this. Plants are very special in the fact that they can turn sunlight into sugar to feed themselves. But fungi can't do that. They're like you and me. They're like animals. They have to eat organic matter that some other organism made. So they're not plants and they're not animals and they don't make their own sugar. And this is a little bit confusing, but one of the most interesting things about fungi that all fungi do is they digest their food outside of their bodies. And you might think, okay, what does that mean? Well, think about what you do. When you eat a salad or a bowl of soup or a hamburger, you chew on it and you take it inside your digestive tract, and then it's inside your body when it's digested. Your stomach breaks it down, it turns it into nutrients and energy for your body. But fungi don't do that. They don't take the food inside. What they do is they push out all of that digestive liquid that's in your stomach, all that stomach acid. Fungi exude that into the environment and they break the food down outside of their bodies and then they absorb the breakdown products. So that's really different from how you and I behave. Thank goodness. If we did that at the Thanksgiving dinner table, it would be really gross. No one would ever want to get together for dinner parties. So fungi are different from animals in that sense. They do their digestion outside, out in the wide world around them, and then they absorb whatever happens after they do that digestion. And fungi are really surprising in terms of how they can look. We're sort of familiar with mold, and we're sort of familiar with mushrooms. You've probably all seen those at some point, but none of us probably have seen either of these fungi. The top there is a little microscopic view from what's called a scanning electron microscope, a very, very, very powerful high-tech piece of equipment. Allows you to see the little thin strands of this fungus that grows on crusts of salt out in the world, like in desert, like where a lake dried up and all that's left is a little crust of salt. Amazingly, there's still fungi that live there. We often think about mushrooms as things that live in dark, wet places, but that's not always true. Sometimes fungi live in really dry, hot, sunny, exposed places, in the desert even. And they also live at the bottom of the ocean. So that picture at the bottom of the screen there is down, deep, deep, deep in the ocean, where there's this hot water boiling out of the Earth's crust. And there's shrimp and anemones and big weird deep sea fishes swimming around. And you wouldn't expect that this is a place that you'd find mushrooms. And you're right, you're not going to find any mushrooms there, but you still can find fungi there. This group of organisms is still present there. And how do we know this? Well, those of you who've been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium before, probably a lot of you, they take their little robot, their little submarine, down deep into the ocean, and they take a little cup full of water down there at 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet deep, and they bring it back to the surface, and they, it's really tightly sealed, and then they take it back to their laboratories and they put that water on a petri dish, and they see what grows out of this water, what was present in that water down deep in the ocean, and they find fungi. There are fungi that live in the water, even way further than the sunlight ever reaches. What are they doing down there? We don't really know. What are their names? We don't really know. What do they look like? What's their ecological role? How do they interact with other organisms? Why are they important for Earth and the functioning of our planet? We're still just beginning to learn about these organisms. So You could be one of those people who decides, you know what, I really want to go down deep in the ocean where people almost never go, and I want to learn about the organisms that live there. And you could say, I'm not just studying the fish and the lobsters and the squid. I'm going to study the fungi of these deep places, and you could be the first. And I will learn from you. You'll publish papers about it, and I'll read your papers, and I'll go, oh my God, that's so cool. I can't wait to learn from the people. Maybe some of you in this class are going to go on to do this work. Something I want to also mention is that fungi can be really, really, really tiny. So that little circle that you see in the middle of the screen there shows what you might see under a microscope. If you were looking at yeast, and yeast are organisms that you've probably been familiar with if you've ever baked bread. So if you bake bread, the reason that your dough rises is that there's little tiny fungi, microscopic fungi called yeast, living in that dough, in that flour. And they eat all the sugar that's in the flour, and they kind of fart. They make carbon dioxide. And that gas swells up the bread dough. And the gluten, all of those proteins in your dough, trap that gas. And so the whole thing rises like a big pillow. So if you want nice, fluffy bread, you got to have fungi in the mix. Yeast are what we have to thank for nice, delicious, fluffy bread. And like I said, they're microscopic. They're little, teeny tiny organisms. That's as big as they ever get. They never get any bigger. They're just a couple microns long. You can't see them with the naked eye. You have to use a microscope for sure. And there's a little tiny mushroom in the background of this image here. And that mushroom is way smaller than my pinky. Probably like 10 of them could fit inside the space of my pinky. So even little tiny mushrooms that aren't microscopic can be super short-lived. They might only last 1 or 2 days. So mushrooms or fungi can be really, really tiny, microscopic, and they can be really short-lived, you know, only lasting a few days at a time. But the opposite is also true. Fungi can be huge, enormous, and really old, really ancient. Now, the mushrooms on the screen don't seem like they're enormous. They seem like normal-sized mushrooms, but there's something tricky about mushrooms. What you see on the screen, what you see in this image here, is not the organism itself. It's just the reproductive structure, like a flower or a fruit of a tree. It's not the tree itself. The real body of this fungus is underground. It lives in the dirt, it lives in the soil, and it spreads out over the whole landscape, and you can't see it. It's hidden from our senses. But the little fibers, the little threads that make these mushrooms to reproduce, like a flower, they're living there all the time, from year to year, even longer than that, from century to century. And in fact, some of these honey mushrooms, that's the kind that's in this picture here, scientists think that they are thousands of years old. One individual that covers hundreds of acres might be, 2,000 years old. That's one of the oldest organisms on Earth, if that's true. And the biomass, the amount of tissue that's there is bigger than a blue whale, way bigger. So some of the biggest and some of the oldest living organisms on Earth are mushrooms, or are fungi. So they can be really tiny and small and short-lived, where they only last a few hours or a few days, and they can be really enormous and really old. And that's one of the reasons I like fungi so much, is that they are all over the map. They do all sorts of different kinds of things. They're really diverse. They can live in the forest. They can live on your pancakes in the back of your fridge. They can live in the salt crust out in the desert. They can live at the bottom of the ocean. They can live up in the air. If you send the spores out into space, they'll survive. Fungi are extremely diverse and resistant, resilient, adaptable group of organisms. They also do some weird stuff. Here's a photo of some mushrooms that glow in the dark. And some of these actually grow right here in California. You can find them in San Mateo County, you can find them in Santa Cruz, you can find them in the Bay Area. They're actually really common. And in the wintertime, if you go out and find these things, you can take them into a dark closet in your house and make sure it's all really dark, no light coming under the door, and let your eyes get used to the dark, and you'll start to see that the gills glow this green color. So mushrooms do some really amazing, cool stuff that you wouldn't expect if you hadn't heard of it before. I'm actually going to skip this or briefly mention it. So there's 3 main stages of a mushroom's life cycle. I'm not going to walk through each little bit of this diagram, but Those two little bean-shaped things up at the upper left of the image, those are spores. That's how mushrooms get around. They're like seeds. They float in the wind, and that's how they find new places to live. The spores float around in the wind, and they get blown to new areas in the forest, and then they settle down on the forest floor, and they make a big carpet, a big network of fibers, like what you see at the upper right there. This sort of like branching underground structure that you can't see with your eyes, but you know that it's there. Any forest you go to around us is going to have lots and lots of what's called a mycelium. It's like the root structures of mushrooms. And when they're ready to, just like a flower or a tree makes fruits and flowers at one time of year, this mycelium, these underground roots of the mushrooms, when they're ready to, at certain times of year, when there's a lot of rain and they've got enough nutrients, they make mushrooms. And that's just the part that we can see. But you should always remember, when you see mushrooms, that's not the whole story. That's not the whole life cycle of the organism. They've got this underground part that you can't see, and that's doing important stuff in the forest all the rest of the year. It's there all the time. And that's something we need to study more. You could become an expert in what the mycelium is doing when it's not producing mushrooms. And I would wait to learn from you. I can't wait till we know more about these organisms and what they're doing all year when we can't see them. Now I'm going to use some kind of fancy words, but they're pretty simple actually. A lot of mushrooms are decomposers. That's just the same as this word that you see on the screen, saprobes. And decomposer just means that they break down dead stuff. They turn dead stuff and they recycle it back into nutrients that other organisms can use. And a lot of the dead stuff they break down is wood. That's one of the main things that mushrooms have learned how to do, is to take wood, which is kind of hard. You know that. You can knock on it, you can try and break it apart with your hands, and it's not easy. A tree is made of tough stuff, but something's got to recycle those nutrients that are there. And mushrooms fill that job. They're like the garbage men in the forest. They take that stuff and they take it to the recycling plant and they break it down, and then it's available for other creatures to use again, or else it would just get locked up in the wood and our forests would fill up with wood and nothing would ever happen again. It would just be all dead trees and nothing else. So we have mushrooms to thank for that. But not only do mushrooms do that, some of them are predators. So this mushroom down at the lower right, those are oyster mushrooms. You probably bought these in stores before. They break down dead wood, that's true, but they also do something else, and it's really exciting. They trap little tiny microscopic worms. They're predators of these little worms that live in the wood that they're growing on. So I bet you didn't know mushrooms can be predators too, but they are. They eat animals, they trap them. They sort of wrap a little lasso around them and they grow around them and they digest them. So that's a really cool thing that some fungi do that not many people know about. But now you know, mushrooms can be predators. So here's just some pictures of mushrooms that are breaking down dead wood in a couple different views. So you've probably all seen these shelf mushrooms that grow out of stumps and logs out in the forest. And think about what would happen if that stump didn't get digested by a mushroom. It would just sit there, and the nutrients that are locked up in that stump would stay there forever, because not many things know how to break down wood, but these mushrooms have figured out how to do it. That little tiny tree, that sapling that you see on the right side of the screen, it grew up and it tried to make a living, but maybe there was too much shade or it couldn't get enough nutrients, and so it died. Poor tree. But we don't want it to stay there. We want to make something with the nutrients that it used to make those little twigs, and these mushrooms are helping to do that. They're growing on the little twigs and the little trunk of that baby sapling, and they're going to recycle the nutrients that are locked up there. But not all mushrooms are decomposers. Not all of the things that you see out in the woods are going to be just breaking down dead organic matter. Some of them are actually parasites. They go after living trees, and they can hurt these trees even. And this sounds bad. We tend to have a sort of a negative idea of a parasite, but these things are really ecologically important. They have their own role to play in habitats and ecosystems around the world. We need these parasites to be to have healthy forests, Sometimes there's too many trees in a forest, too many little seedlings germinated, and they're all crowded together. And they're all trying to compete for the same resources, same amount of water, same amount of light. And you need something to come through and sort of thin out that forest to sort of kill some of the trees and make room for other trees to live. And that's what some of these fungi do. Some of these parasitic fungi are really common. You'll see these honey mushrooms and Dyer's polypores. Some of them actually are parasites of insects, and some of those we actually appreciate because they kill things like mosquitoes and flies and cicadas. You know, they're not going to kill all of them, but one fewer mosquito, I'll take it. So parasites are another important role that some fungi play in the environment. And some of them do really strange, interesting things. Here's an example of a fungus that infects these little plants, and it makes these fake flowers. That bright yellow color is all because of the fungus that infected them. That plant would never do that on its own. And the fungus is trying to make a fake flower so that insects come and try and pollinate the flower, but instead of pollinating it, they get covered in spores from the fungus and they spread those spores around. So it's very crafty, very ingenious evolutionary story that these fungi have come up with. Here's another example of a fake flower that fungi make. This was recently described just a few weeks ago, or there was some news stories about it a few weeks ago. I don't know how old this relationship has been known, but these are not flowers. These are what would have become flowers, but instead they were infected by a fungus that made these sort of wild looking yellow blobs on top of the little stems. And the same idea applies. They attract pollinators that would normally be coming to get nectar and pollen. And instead they're getting covered in spores that the fungus makes, and they're spreading those spores out through the environment. So fungi are really tricky, really amazing to learn their various different life histories. And it's really important to study some of these parasitic fungi because they actually do have harmful effects on organisms that we're concerned about, on other animals that we want to keep safe, but everything gets diseases, not just humans. We all know about disease this year, of course, but the same thing happens to every kind of group of organisms. So there's a disease called white nose syndrome that grows on the noses of bats, especially in northeastern North America. So if you go to New England, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, the northeastern part of the country, anywhere where there's really cold winters and the bats hibernate in caves, some of them are getting infected with this new fungus, this disease called white nose, and it's harming their populations. The bats are dying in many places, which is a concern. You know, we as humans are concerned with keeping populations of other organisms healthy, and we want to take care of them. So it means we have to understand these diseases more closely. So you could go, if you wanted to research bats, you could grow up to become a bat researcher and study how fungi interact with them, and maybe you could find a way to keep them safe from this new disease. A similar thing is happening with snakes these days. It's called snake fungal disease. So maybe you want to study reptiles. You might also have to study fungi if you want to learn about how to conserve them, how to keep their populations safe. But my favorite group of fungi are not the decomposers. They're not the parasites. There's this fancy word called mycorrhizae. You can practice saying that if you want right now. Say it out loud to yourself. Mycorrhizae. Not too hard. Mycorrhizae. And what this means in Latin is fungus root. And the reason that it's called fungus root, this relationship, is that these mushrooms wrap themselves around the roots of living trees and they actually help them. They don't hurt them, they don't recycle them, they actually are helpers. And the tree, remember, what can plants do that fungi can't? Remember what I said earlier in the talk? Plants can make their own sugar out of sunlight. That's that magic trick that we call photosynthesis. And fungi can't do that. So they can't make their own sugar. They got to get their sugar from somewhere else. And in this relationship that some fungi do, not all, they get their sugar directly from a tree. And that tree sends them sugar in exchange for water and nutrients. So the mushroom is gathering all of those tasty nutrients from the soil, all the water from the soil, and it's wrapping itself around the roots of that tree and saying, here, I'll give you some water and some nutrients if you give me some sugar. So these two organisms, this living plant, this tree or shrub, and this fungus are helping each other live. They're partnering their different skills, and they're making life possible for each other. So they're really important in forests all over the world. Pretty much anywhere you go on the planet, you're going to find this relationship, and it's really important for helping trees survive. So here's just another way of seeing this. The energy from the sun, all of that sunlight, lands on the leaves of a tree. Sorry, there's a plane going overhead right now. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's really loud. The energy from the sunlight lands on the leaves of a tree, and the tree knows how to make sugar with that using those little tiny chlorophyll molecules. Chlorophyll is the compound in there that makes them green, and it's also what enables them to do this photosynthetic process where they make sugar. That sugar then flows from the leaf into the twigs, into the branches, down the trunk, and into the roots, into the soil. And now you can't see what's going on anymore, but that mycelium, those roots that you can see at the bottom of the screen there, that's all fungal roots. They're not really roots. They act differently, but you can think of them that way. They're like a big carpet of fibers, a big network of fungus. And that fungus is constantly gathering water. It's constantly gathering nutrients from the soil that the plant needs to survive. And so they're exchanging these resources. Sugar in one direction, water and nutrients in the other, constantly flowing back and forth, helping each other survive. So one more time, practice saying that word to yourself. Mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae. My favorite ecological interaction that fungi do. Okay. I use an app on my phone really frequently called iNaturalist. And I don't think that you can use iNaturalist if you're below a certain age, but if you want to, you can use this other app called Seek, which is basically the same thing, but for younger users. And when you're old enough, then you can make your own account on iNaturalist, but they do very similar things. If you have a smartphone, or you can use it on the computer too, you can use this app to take pictures of organisms, and it will help you figure out what they are. And over time, as you learn about the organisms that are around you using this app, it'll try and give you some guesses as to what you might be seeing. You can start to make documentation. You can start to upload and share the images that you're taking to a big network of people around the world who will use that in their research. And this is something I do all the time, and we call this community science or citizen science. And as you grow up, some of you will go on to study biology, ecology, and evolution in college. And this whole idea of community science is just becoming more and more important. It will be something that you will definitely want to use if you're a scientist who studies living creatures. I use it all the time, and it helps us to make maps of where organisms live. So it helps us to keep track of where on the planet different creatures exist, what they're doing ecologically, so what sort of organisms they're interacting with, and maybe how they're changing over time. Where an organism lives one year may not be the same place that it lives the next year. Some organisms spread and grow and expand over the surface of the earth, especially in the face of something like climate change, in the face of global warming, changing temperatures, changing weather, changing rainfall, pushes organisms around on the face of the earth. They go to new places that they never lived before. And they might go extinct in some places where they used to live. So I think it's really important to keep track of all of this. And the best way to do that is to use these apps like iNaturalist and Seek. So one example of an organism that we want to keep track of is this deathcap mushroom, which is a mushroom that came to California from Europe accidentally. We moved it here. Humans accidentally moved it here. And now it's spreading really widely through the state. It's all over the West Coast now, all the way up to Seattle, all the way up to British Columbia, and all the way down to the Mexican border. So it's really exploded outwards from the Bay Area where it was originally introduced. And the best way to keep track of it is to have everyday people, not just scientists, mostly not scientists, but people who just like nature, going out in the woods, going on their hikes, and taking pictures of what they see and sharing it with one another using these apps like iNaturalist and Seek. So ask your parents, if you're walking around with your kids, you can consider downloading these apps for your smartphone, and you can sort of share this experience together as a family, and document what you're finding and make it useful for scientists who are using this data to do real, actual academic research. So I just want to say thank you to Catherine for having me, inviting me today, and for talking to you all. And thanks for sitting through it. I hope you get a chance to get out in the woods and see some of these beautiful organisms in the coming weeks here. And I want to sort of wrap it up pretty quick so that if there's questions that you all had, maybe we can get around to answering some of them. So yeah, thanks again, and I hope you learned something about the fascinating world of fungi.
Thank you, Christian. It looks like we don't have any questions in the Q&A right now, but if anyone, oh, it looks like someone has a question.
Heather raised her hand, yeah.
Yeah, let's see. Heather, I will allow you to talk. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I've asked to unmute Heather, but I don't know if she's getting the notification.
Yeah, I did too. Well, Heather, if you can't unmute, go ahead and type in the chat. Let's see.
Okay, I'm seeing some questions now.
Okay, cool. Great.
So, oh yeah, Heather had no microphone. So Heather, yeah, just type your question. All right, so Myrna asked, are lichens related to fungi? And the answer is yes. In fact, it's a really complicated answer, but well, it's simple in one way, but it's complicated as soon as you start to think about it. Lichens are not just related to fungi, they are part fungi. So lichens are a symbiotic organism where the fungus and the algae, or in some cases cyanobacteria, are living together in the same body. So they're not just related to fungi, they are fungi, but they're also algae. So it's a really interesting story. I don't know very much about lichens, but they're really fascinating creatures. What park do I recommend to go to see mushrooms? Oh, there's so many good ones in the Bay Area that if you go at the right time of year, when it's wet, December, January, pretty much any park will have mushrooms. But redwood habitats are really good. Oak forests are really good. Yeah, almost any park works. Grasslands, you're probably going to see less fungi than in most places. So if you go to a big open space that's mostly meadows and rocks, then probably not as many, although you will see some cool lichens on the rocks undoubtedly. But going into almost any forest when it's wet, the weather conditions are the most important variable to think about. Can I talk about fir trees and mycorrhizae? So Carol, is your question specifically about like Douglas fir? They're really good mycorrhizal hosts. They definitely have a lot of fungi that live on their roots. In fact, some of the fungi that live with Douglas fir are super specific. They only grow with Douglas fir. They'll never grow with any other tree. So they have to have a Douglas fir around, or else you won't find that mushroom. And it's a really common tree, not only in our area, but all the way up into the, you find them in the Rocky Mountains as well. They go way down south and way up north into British Columbia and across the boreal. I don't know how far east they go, but it's a very common and abundant forest tree of the North American continent, the Western North American continent. Fungi and tide pools, they're there, but they're not easy to find. They're going to be microscopic. They're going to be the kind of marine fungi that are much more poorly known. We don't really know a lot about fungi that live on sand grains and in tide pools and in the water column in the ocean, but they're definitely there. And people are starting to pay more and more attention to this group of fungi, the marine fungi. I wish I could answer your question. I know there's at least one that you can kind of see that grows on algae. And it makes these little, it's a parasite. So it's a parasite of this red algae. And if you go to a tide pool, you might be lucky enough to see an algae that looks like it's got all these little holes in it. And that's actually a fungus called, it's got a really weird name. It's called Halogenardia. I had to take hours to learn to pronounce that one.
I had a question about the fires
yes.
in the CZU fire zone. How has that impacted the mushrooms in this recent winter?
It's been a really I've been going back to do surveys there because I had some survey sites that I was visiting basically every week for 2 years before the fire. And then this year, it's been amazing to see just how different everything is. Most fungi are gone, at least in the short term, but there's a whole new set of fungi that were never there before. And seeing these fire following fungi, there's this whole group of organisms that are specifically adapted to respond to fire, has been truly amazing. I've learned so much, and they're definitely going to help progress that forest to whatever new trajectory it's on. They're a major part of getting the soil ready for new plants to grow, recycling all the dead wood that there is now because so many trees died. Fungi are definitely there. They're definitely doing their job, and we'll see what it looks like in 10 years. All right, Nina asked a question about fungi in cold climates. The answer is yes. Fungi can definitely survive some extreme cold. There are fungi that live on, the Antarctic continent. They're not big mushroom forming fungi, most of them, but they're there. You'll find fungi in the tundra where it's frozen a lot of the year. You'll find fungi pretty much anywhere where there's organic matter. If there's other organisms, other plants, you'll find fungi living with them.
Do you have a favorite fungi or a favorite mushroom?
I like so many of them. I really need to come up with a better answer to this question because people ask me, but I feel like I have at least like 24 or 36. I don't know how many dozens of mushrooms I could come up with that on any given day I feel particularly smitten with.
And please mention your book for those who might be interested in looking into that.
Yeah, so if you live locally, anywhere on the California coast, basically, as well as the Sierra foothills, but really, if you're in San Mateo, you're like right in the middle of the range that we covered in our book. My co-author Noah Siegel and I wrote a book called Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, and it's a field guide that will help you identify, learn to recognize pretty much all of the mushrooms that you're likely to find in the forests of the Central California coast. You can get it from Amazon, or you can get it from the authors, aka me, directly if you order it from our website, redwoodcoastmushrooms.org. But yeah, it's a book that we really intended to be visual, so you're going to be looking at a lot of pictures, and people seem to have a pretty good time learning how to recognize fungi by sort of paging through it repeatedly and reading our description. So if you get it, I hope you get some good use out of it. But that was actually sort of tied back to Catherine's last question about my favorite fungus. If you get the book, there's a blue mushroom on the cover called Leptonia carnea, and it's like iridescent. It has a color that you'd never expect to see on a mushroom, and it lives in the redwood forests, and I just love that mushroom. It's maybe my favorite, I would say.
Also, let's see. I had a question that just left. It'll come back. 1 second.
No worries. So I I haven't used the app that I mentioned very much, the Seek app, but they just really sort of like revamped it and made it a lot better than it was before. So people are using it a lot now, and I really recommend if you are maybe doing more homeschooling right now because of COVID, and you want to get out in the woods, but you don't know any sort of naturalists in your community, you can sort of get a pretend naturalist, a pretend teacher, if you use the Seek app to give you some ideas of the organisms you're seeing around you, even in gardens, your flowers, your horticultural plants. It's actually pretty good at giving you a guess as to what these living things are around you. And then you can go take that to Google and learn lots more about them.
Remembered my question.
Good question.
So if you were a beginner mushroom identifier, what are some of the things that you would recommend? I mean, when you'd probably like a teaser to your book, but just the different things that you'd recommend to look at to differentiate between different mushrooms.
Yeah, so that's something I didn't get much into because it's a whole big complex topic that takes like probably a day to really get you up to speed on. But some of you have probably heard of the idea of a spore print. So this is where you take the cap of a mushroom and you take the stem out and leave the cap sitting on a piece of glass or a piece of paper for a couple hours, maybe overnight. And then in the morning, you lift that cap up, and there's a whole bunch of spores that the gills of that mushroom have left on the paper, the glass. And the color of that spore print is sort of the number one first thing you want to learn to do as a beginner, is to see what that color is. And that will just help you go down the road of identifying your mushroom way more easily than any other feature. So learn to take spore prints. They're really easy. They're really fun. Kids love doing them. And they're an extremely valuable piece of identification information.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Heather.
I don't, oh, here it is, I see. I do teach classes, I do lead mushroom walks, and you can, well, this year I've done very little in-person stuff, obviously, but if you get plugged into places like McClellan Ranch, which is down near Cupertino, that's a place where I've taught classes, weekend classes as well as evening classes before. So either, you know, like just 2-day or a series of weeks where we meet on certain nights. But if you go to my tour site, redwoodcoasttours.com, you can set up private walks and you'll be notified of events that I teach. And I'll drop that in the chat here if possible. I don't know how.
I'll answer it for the
Okay, cool.
question.
But yeah, if you get in touch with me, I'm pretty easy to find online, and you can set up classes or look for existing workshops that we, that I arrange at different times of year in different places. I go all the way up to Northern California, all the way to Southern California. I drive all over the place. Alrighty.
Any last questions? Anyone else has burning questions for Christian?
No more burning. We've had enough fire.
Yeah, no more burning. Let's cut that out. Yeah. So these mushrooms. Oh, that's great.
Oh.
These mushrooms, I just was curious, that are entering into the fire zone, that are fire adapted to responding to fire. Are they part of the succession process for plants to kind of start that process over again?
Definitely. They're trying to, well, not trying, they're stabilizing the soil. So when the mycelium grows out through all that burned soil that's really soft and fluffy and blows away really easy, it has to sort of become solid again for plants to be able to germinate. And so the mycelium definitely probably has a role in stabilizing that, and making the ground ready for plants to grow again, and maybe even to wrap itself around the roots of those plants and do that mycorrhizae that we talked about, where they're going to send water and nutrients to these plants that are just getting established in these burned forests. So it's really, really important for fungi to be there.
That's great. That's great to hear. I mean, the forests are naturally adapted to responding to fire, and
Yep.
they'll be finding their way back to us soon.
It looks like Courtney has her hand raised.
Go ahead and unmute Courtney if you have a question.
All right, I see Courtney's message there, but I don't know if we're going to be able to hear Courtney.
Okay, yeah. No worries. If anyone has any last questions to type into the chat, please do that now. And any last things that you want to express to our audience about fungi?
I really encourage you to engage with them. Don't be scared of them. Maybe that's not an issue anymore. Maybe the culture has changed, but when I was growing up, my parents really discouraged me from looking at fungi. Thankfully, they support it now. They're not scared of fungi anymore. But if there's such an easy group of organisms to engage with because they don't run away from you. They're not like birds where you have to chase them around all the time. You can walk right up to them and pick them up and look closely at their details. And they're so beautiful. I mean, they're amazing to paint or to try and draw, to photograph. and you'll be part of a community that's growing every year. There's so many mushroom clubs in Central California that you'll be able to get plugged in with lots of people who will help you learn more about them. So I can't recommend it enough. The more you look at mushrooms, the more you'll start learning about plants and insects and the little salamanders that you find living under them, eating the bugs that are attracted to the mushrooms. So it's a way of leading you to all of the other questions in the forest, all of the other organisms. You start on one end and you'll learn about everything by the end of it.
Great. And I know that there are mushroom fairs at different points in the year in Santa Cruz, San Francisco as well. Is that correct? I mean, maybe not this year, but in past years? Or
We're already past the season mostly for this year. But next year, if things go better, hopefully, you should expect around December, January to see lots of different mushroom fairs happening. San Francisco, Santa Cruz have really big ones. The East Bay has a big one. Yeah, there's tons of mushroom fairs that you can go find out every year.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge about mushrooms. And if you missed this webinar, and or if you logged in late or you want to watch it again, we're going to post it on YouTube soon. Well, thank you so much, Christian, for joining us. And hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right.
Thank you all for joining.
I'm going to go look at mushrooms, actually.
That sounds good.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.